Look, we're already up to 36 Republican no votes. And of course, these aren't final. We're still seeing the votes come in. People could change their minds. But that is a clear indication that not only are Democrats not happy with this package, but even Republicans, and not just a handful of Republicans, 36 House Republicans say they don't care that the president-elect said this was the deal he wanted. They don't care that Elon Musk was behind this. This is not what they want. And, you know, one of the big issues here is the debt ceiling issue. Suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years is not something many Republicans are comfortable doing. And so it's clear we're going to be back to the drawing board after this. It's hard to see what the path forward is from here. And of course, we're running out of time with the government shutdown deadline approaching quickly tomorrow.
Yeah, and Steph, tell us more about the 36. Howard Dean, and if they do speak, if they gavel anything, we'll take that. But Howard Dean was saying on the current numbers, the Republicans don't have the votes, and you're pointing out that the 37 just jumped 36 to 37 is intra-party rejection, opposition to what was this Trump-Musk effort, quote unquote. So explain more what you mean by those 37 Republicans against what is a Republican proposal.
Well, I mean, just as we see those numbers tick up more and more, it just shows that there are still a significant number of Republicans, even in the House, who are not going to just take whatever Trump gives them and vote for it, no questions asked. And it also shows, of course, this particular vote needs 2/3 majority to pass, which is clearly not going to happen at this point. But even if they were to move on and take a little bit more time, go through rules and bring this back to the floor to try to pass it with a simple majority, Republicans don't even have the votes to pass it with a simple majority right now, again, where things stand at the moment. But a part of this whole process was so that Trump and Musk could see the votes. They could see who will buck them. They could see the names of who is willing to vote in line with them, who is willing to push back, and they can see what they're working with and move forward from there. But there's still a lot up in the air, and there was still lots of pushback to the original plan that came out just the other day. So it's not clear that the first bill would have necessarily had the votes needed to move forward. It would probably have been more likely, but it's clear by these numbers, as we see these no votes keep ticking up, that it's just not what Republicans or Democrats.
Let's listen in.
2/3 not being in the affirmative, the rules are not suspended and the bill is not passed.
There you have it. The vote is now officially formal, and we can report, according to the rules of the United States Congress, the House of Representatives has rejected this Republican effort to suspend the rules to go forward into irregular order to try to get that bill passed. So that is now the House in recess. Your thoughts, Libby, about Republicans losing their vote, failing at this effort tonight?
I mean, this is remarkable. They had a bipartisan deal. And so Speaker Johnson had Democrats in the House who were willing to get on board. They lost things in this process of Republicans just throwing out the bipartisan deal, like $190 million in funding research into children's cancer. Also dealing with some things that have been talked about a lot, dealing with these pharmacy benefit managers. You might have heard commercials about that. Critics call them the middlemen between patients and insurers. Well, there was something in there that would prevent them from price spreading. There was also language in there to lower prescription drug costs. So both sides got things that they wanted, and Republicans threw it all out. I'll point out something. I really appreciated Steph talking about the numbers and how many Republicans defected. Note how Democrats hung together. They really hung together. They voted as a bloc. You know, for Democrats, this has been an incredibly crushing few weeks since Trump won and they lost the House and Senate. This is the first time I've seen them able to really get together and find a message and find a way to communicate effectively here to their supporters and to the American people. They're talking about the Musk-Johnson bill. They're trying to sort of put Musk above Trump. They're playing this strategy here that they just haven't had really the mojo to do in the last couple of weeks. They seem to have found some messaging right now, Ari.
The Musk-Johnson proposal is not serious. It's laughable. Extreme MAGA Republicans are driving us to a government shutdown.
Moments after he said that, Jeffries walked into a closed-door meeting with his caucus, where members chanted, "Hell no," to the new proposal. And joining me now is one of those members, Congressman Robert Garcia of California. Wow. Congressman, this has been something to watch today. And, it is interesting. There are conservatives who like to refer to the Democratic Party as the mommy party and Republicans as the daddy party. But they seem to, at this moment, have two daddies, two alternate daddies, and it's not clear who's the daddy in charge. It feels like it's Elon Musk, but is that the way it feels on the Hill?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we are beginning and witnessing the start of the Elon Musk presidency. There is no question. And Donald Trump has been regulated to now the vice president to Elon Musk's new administration. The Republican Party here in the House completely bent the knee to Elon Musk. He says something, they jump. And it's just insane and crazy that a deal that had been negotiated by Speaker Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries and the Senate was completely tanked because of Elon Musk sending out messages on X and his social media platform. And so this is complete insanity. There is now this new administration developing, at the head being Elon Musk. And the fact that we have now the richest man on the planet dictating what the United States Congress should be doing is completely insane, dangerous, and Americans should be very concerned.
There's even talk, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's always good for a weird idea, but it doesn't seem that she's the only one saying it, is floating the idea that the Speaker of the House should not even be Mike Johnson. It should be Elon Musk. Is that something that more than just she is saying among your Republican colleagues?
I mean, absolutely. I think that Mike Johnson's going to have a hard time staying on as Speaker come January, considering this complete disaster that is happening and unfolding right now in the Congress. I mean, remember, there was a bipartisan deal that was negotiated, and we're talking about $100 billion of disaster assistance that's on the table for North Carolina, for Florida, for my home state of California, all now completely gone and wiped out because what Elon Musk really wants and what Donald Trump really wants is to eliminate that debt ceiling so that they can then transfer all of the wealth from hardworking Americans, working class people, and give it to the top 1%, to the billionaires, to Elon Musk companies and all of their rich friends. That's what this is all about while they gut Social Security and destroy the social safety net.
Yeah, it does feel it's giving bank heist, that they want to eliminate the debt ceiling so that they can go ahead and increase the size of that tax cut. I think it's been clear the tax cut was the point of the election for the billionaire class. But in order to get to the next step, the idea is that Trump at least nominally would have to become president. If on January 6th of next year, Elon Musk said pass nothing, he's ordered House Republicans to pass nothing until Donald Trump is inaugurated, how would that even functionally happen? If we're in a shutdown government, how does the January 6th formal transfer of power, the former acceptance of the Electoral College results play out? If Mike Johnson is not Speaker, if there is no Speaker on January 6th, our producers were trying to do some research and understand whether you could even do the January 6th ceremonial meeting.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the truth is that the Congress has to certify the election. The only way to certify an election is to have a speaker that's actually gaveling us in as a Congress. And so Donald Trump also knows that he needs to ensure that there's a speaker in place so that elections can be certified and then he can be inaugurated, of course, on Inauguration Day. And so that can turn into a complete mess if they don't figure this out. But I also want to go back to one thing you just said, which is really important. Why does Elon Musk actually not want Congress to do anything? A government shutdown for Elon Musk means that he can then focus on ensuring that debt ceiling, which is all he cares about, is not in place. He can continue to take money and wealth from middle class and working class people, give it to himself and his companies, and at the same time, he could care less about the millions of Americans who will be impacted by a government shutdown. And I think people need to understand that a government shutdown actually means that our TSA agents at our airports, that are folks that are in air traffic control at our airports as well, that are millions of people aren't going to get paid during the holidays. So what Republicans want is to ensure that working class people don't get a paycheck, but then transfer their wealth to Elon Musk. That's what this is all about.
Right, and that was going to be my next question, is to go through some of the other things. I mean, the last time we had a government shutdown for a few days, you're talking about all the national parks closing, but then those staff don't get paid, all the museums in D.C. closing, and those very low-paid security guards and others don't get paid, the people who clean the Capitol. We're talking about low-wage federal workers literally going without during the Christmas holidays.
That's exactly right. And that's, I think, what's the most cruel about this absolute moment. While Elon Musk is arguing and advocating for a complete shutdown, he could care less about all those TSA agents, about folks that are cleaning our buildings, about people that need Social Security agents to be able to answer their questions. He could care less about the military, our men and women in uniform that are dependent on an actual paycheck. And remember that they actually won't get paid come that next pay holiday. And so what this really means is folks that are maybe putting presents on their credit card, when we are making choices about what presents to buy for their kids or their family during Christmas, won't have the security of knowing if they're going to get paid. And we're talking about impacts to millions of people. And by the way, the federal workforce, 85% of them work outside of DC. So these are our neighbors across the country. And Elon Musk is a billionaire, the richest man in the world, and he's got to be stopped.
Yeah, because he would definitely get paid. When that tax cut, if they extend that tax cut, he's going to get paid big time. He's getting up near trillionaire status about the amount of money he's going to be able to get from the federal government. Congressman Robert Garcia, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Well, you are now watching live coverage of the total collapse of the Elon Musk-Donald Trump partnership in governing in the House of Representatives tonight. Elon Musk and Donald Trump took over the leadership of the Republican House of Representatives, the leadership in that building in the last 24 hours, and negotiated what Donald Trump falsely called a deal. The problem was they were negotiating with themselves. In Congress, a deal is compromise legislation that creates enough votes, and you know ahead of time that it creates enough votes, to pass a bill through the House and then pass it through the Senate with enough votes, and then with the agreement that it will be signed by the president. That's a deal. In Congress, every deal is a three-way deal involving enough votes to pass the House, enough votes to pass the Senate, with a bill that the president has already agreed to sign. That's what a deal is. It was impossible for Donald Trump and Elon Musk to make a deal without negotiating with Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, and President Biden. There is no deal in Washington now without President Biden's signature, something Elon Musk apparently doesn't know. But still, Donald Trump said, quote, Speaker Mike Johnson and the House have come to a very good deal for the American people. That's what he said earlier today. Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson obviously realizing that both Elon Musk and Donald Trump are legislatively insane, decided to let the insane and impossible Musk-Trump bill come to a vote in the House tonight.
This is Washington. This is how the lawmaking is done. It's a long process. Sometimes it takes a while to reach consensus, but we're going to do the right thing here tonight.
No. That was not how lawmaking was done. Mike Johnson knew when he was saying that the legislatively insane Musk-Trump bill was going to fail spectacularly when the House voted a few minutes later. After a relentless 24 hours of pressure from Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, who is obviously the richest person in the history of Republican politics, 36 Republican members of the House, 38 Republican members of the House of Representatives said no to Elon Musk. 38 Republican members of the House said no to Donald Trump. After having their political futures threatened by both Donald Trump and Elon Musk, Trump and Musk said that anyone who voted against this deal should be knocked out of office in the next election. They threatened the political lives of those 38 members of the House. Donald Trump threatened Republicans who didn't vote for this bill today, saying they, quote, should be primaried and disposed of as quickly as possible. Donald Trump has never been more directly and personally threatening to Republicans than he was today, and Donald Trump lost. Donald Trump's threats meant nothing to 38 Republican members of the House. Elon Musk's threats and his billions meant nothing to 38 Republican members of the House. So far, Elon Musk has failed at every public lobbying attempt he has made since the presidential election. Elon Musk told Republican senators who they must vote for majority leader next year, and Republican senators said no. Elon Musk candidate came in third in the election for the Republican majority leader of the Senate next year. Elon Musk's support meant nothing to Republican senators. Elon Musk was part of the group that hatched the brilliant idea of having Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Elon Musk lobbied publicly for Matt Gaetz to be confirmed as Attorney General. Elon Musk lost badly in that lobbying effort. And then yesterday, Elon Musk decided to tell the Republican Speaker of the House and the Republican members of the House of Representatives that the bill that they negotiated to pass the House, pass the Senate, and be signed by President Biden was no good. And so Speaker Johnson, in effect today, said to Elon Musk and Donald Trump, go ahead, show us how to do it. And Elon Musk got crushed on the House floor by Republicans, 38 Republicans on the House floor, crushed and humiliated Elon Musk and Donald Trump at the same time. Republican speakers of the House in the 21st century have repeatedly had to deal with some of the most ignorant and irreversibly stupid members of the House of Representatives in history. None more ignorant or more irreversibly stupid about legislating than Elon Musk, who in the last 24 hours has proved himself to be even stupider than Donald Trump about how the House of Representatives works, how the Senate works, how the presidency works. In other words, how a bill becomes a law. Elon Musk didn't learn that in his South African elementary school like the rest of us did in the United States in elementary school or high school at the latest. They didn't have that little song about how a bill becomes a law in Elon Musk's South African private school. Here is just one of the 38 Republicans who Elon Musk and Donald Trump promised to destroy today for voting against their bill.
It's embarrassing. It's shameful. Yes, I think this bill is better than it was yesterday on certain respects, but to take this bill yesterday and congratulate yourself because it's shorter in pages, but increases the debt by $5 trillion is asinine. And that's precisely what Republicans are doing.
Does he sound afraid of Elon Musk? Does he sound afraid of Donald Trump? That's Chip Roy of Texas. Before the vote today, Donald Trump said this about Chip Roy. Chip Roy is just another ambitious guy with no talent. By the way, how's Bob Good doing? I hope some talented challengers are getting ready in the great state of Texas to go after Chip in the primary. He won't have a chance. After Donald Trump's ultimate threat against Chip Roy and Bob Good, they were both among the 38 Republicans who voted against Donald Trump and voted against Elon Musk after they both issued the ultimate threat they could possibly issue to a politician: we will kill your political career. They cast that vote against Donald Trump in the face of the most extreme threat he has ever issued to members of the House of Representatives. It is extremely unlikely, even at this stage, at this hour, of Elon Musk's spectacular failure as a legislator, that he knows there is only one person in the United States Senate who can bring a bill to a vote in the Senate. Of course he doesn't know that. Senator Chuck Schumer said in a statement, quote, "It's a good thing the bill failed in the House. Now it's time to go back to the bipartisan agreement we came to." That's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the only person who can bring a bill to a vote in the United States Senate. You don't have to have a deal if the Majority Leader of the United States Senate has not agreed to bring your bill up to a vote and vote for it. So even if, at the last minute, those 38 Republicans decided that they really were too afraid of Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and they voted to pass the Musk-Trump bill, it would have passed the House of Representatives, and then it would have died. It would have gone to the United States Senate. The phrase for that kind of bill arriving in the Senate is dead on arrival. But Republicans in the House killed the Musk-Trump bill without Chuck Schumer having to even look at it. It is impossible to overstate how colossal a failure this is for Donald Trump, who is a lame duck now every day for the next 4 years. He's a lame duck. He can never run again. And for Elon Musk, who embarked on his first legislative adventure and could not have failed more spectacularly. And this is very good news for America. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are not in charge of legislating in Congress. 38 Republicans think what Donald Trump and Elon Musk want to do is insane. Asinine is actually one of the words that was used on the floor today by Republican Chip Roy. The weakness of Donald Trump in the Republican House of Representatives has now been fully exposed, and we have never seen anything like it in an incoming president with his own party. And the weakness and legislative stupidity of Elon Musk has now been fully exposed to all Republicans who all know how badly Elon Musk lost today. And enough Republicans are not afraid of either Donald Trump or Elon Musk, even when facing the most extreme threats Donald Trump and Elon Musk have ever aimed at politicians. Obviously, Democrats in the House did not vote for a bill that Elon Musk and Donald Trump negotiated among themselves without speaking to a single Democrat about it. The Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, said this before the vote that crushed the Musk-Trump bill.
We reached a bipartisan agreement to be there for farmers and families, children, seniors, working class Americans all across the country. The men and women who serve this country in uniform and our veterans. House Republicans have abandoned that bipartisan agreement that we entered into in good faith. A bill that House Republicans negotiated gave us your word that we were going to move forward together on behalf of the American people. It was a Republican drafted bill that was posted by House Republicans. And then one or two puppet masters weigh in, and the extreme MAGA Republicans decide to do the bidding of the wealthy, the well-off, the well-connected, millionaires and billionaires, not working-class people all across America.
One of the changes Elon Musk and Donald Trump made to the bill was to eliminate support of research on children's cancer. And Donald Trump, at the last minute, decided he wanted to add a dramatic increase in the debt ceiling, an unprecedented increase in the debt ceiling, to the bill, even though the government won't come close to reaching its debt limit until June. Donald Trump actually wants to pass a bill that will completely suspend the debt ceiling, just totally eliminate it. There is no debt limit for the United States for 2 years, so that Donald Trump can run up the debt to any level at all with his tax cuts for billionaires like Elon Musk.
The provisions in this bill, particularly as it relates to suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years, are designed to bring about a massive tax cut, unpaid for wealthy donors and for wealthy corporations, for millionaires and billionaires who clearly some in this Congress are working for. And this bill is validation for it. Now, what's been interesting to me is that for decades, the Republican Party has lectured America about fiscal responsibility, about the debt and the deficit. It's always been phony. This bill proves it. The one thing we do know is that every time a Republican president comes into office, the one thing we can count on Republicans to do is to pass a massive tax cut for wealthy Americans, and in the process, stick working class Americans with the bill by raising the deficit and the debt. The phoniness in claiming that extreme MAGA Republicans are about working class Americans or the party of fiscal responsibility, nothing could be further from the truth. When you run up the debt and the deficit, middle class families pay, working class families pay, and we are going to defend them.
But we begin with breaking news in Atlanta, where a Georgia appeals court has just stripped Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis from the 2020 election interference case against Donald Trump in that state. Let's bring in Greg Bluestein from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and former Assistant Manhattan District Attorney Catherine Christian. So, Greg, this filing just came down. It's some 30-plus pages. Walk us through what we know.
Yeah, we're still going through the filing, but we know this completely upends what's expected to be the last criminal case pending against the former president. Remember, this case is still ongoing. District Attorney Fani Willis had that very high-profile questions about whether there's a conflict of interest involving former Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade. Well, this court ruled that there is an apparent conflict of interest that merits her dismissal from the case. I'll read you one quote. While we recognize that an appearance of impropriety generally is not enough to support disqualification, this is the rare case in which disqualification is mandated and no other remedy will suffice to restore public confidence in the integrity of these proceedings. So this can still be appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court. It is expected to be appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, but this is a really decisive ruling against Fani Willis being able to continue this case.
Catherine, what's your reaction? What do you make of this ruling?
It's not shocking. It was shocking when we found out that there was this relationship, and you just said it was an unforced error. But usually appellate courts defer to the lower court, the trial judge, who fashioned a remedy. He said Nathan Wade, that's the man she was having an affair with, had to leave, but the office could stay. And this court has said, nope, they didn't. This court said that Judge McAfee did not really appreciate that her decision-making wasn't just the indictment. It was who to charge, how to charge it, and that's at the time when this alleged romantic relationship was going on. And they said that also was one of the reasons why they think it's more than an appearance of impropriety. It's a conflict of interest. And not just her, the entire office is disqualified. So this is another Trump indictment that sort of will disappear. And yes, they will appeal it, but, you know, Donald Trump's defense team will use the same arguments that they did for the Manhattan DA's office and say he's now going to be president. This should be suspended while he's president because you can't prosecute a sitting president.
So you think this just goes away, that this is the end of this case?
Well, practically, yes. I'm certain, I shouldn't say I'm certain, probably the Fulton County DA will appeal it, but Donald Trump is going to be president. And his lawyers are going to say, you know, he's not going to Fulton County to appear in any case. So if anything's going to happen, you have to wait until 2029 when he's no longer in office. So this effectively is another case that sort of will just, one of the 4 indictments that will disappear.
One option I am understanding, Greg, is this could end up being handed off to a different office, different prosecutor. Is there any other office or prosecutor in Georgia you think would make sense that would be willing to take this up?
That's such a good question, because there is a prosecuting attorney's council that could ostensibly take up a case like this. But earlier on this year, that same prosecuting attorney's council special prosecutor decided not to pursue similar charges against Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who Fani Willis was earlier disqualified against seeking charges against because of another conflict of interest, a completely separate conflict of interest. So they've already signaled they're very unlikely to seek any sort of charges against any of these co-defendants. And it's also important to note that the judges, the benches, the appellate court benches in Georgia are very conservative. The Court of Appeals is very conservative, and the Supreme Court, 8 of the 9 justices were appointed by Republican governors. So it's a very conservative bench here in Georgia.
So to be clear, Catherine, this case and this ruling is not just regarding the charges against Trump. This is a RICO case. We know there were multiple defendants or co-defendants. What happens as far as those co-defendants go?
All of the defendants, because of clearly if Donald Trump was affected by this conflict of interest, so were all of his co-defendants. It's not fair that they have to proceed, but Donald Trump gets off, meaning his case gets dismissed. So all of, and I believe there are 15 remaining defendants.
What about the people who took plea deals? The people who pled guilty will probably argue that their plea should be withdrawn. That will be a whole other, proceeding. It could be argued that, no, their plea was knowing, involuntary, and intelligent, but they will argue the same conflict existed for us, and we would have never pled guilty if we knew about it. So this will be continued at least to those 4 defendants and them trying to get their pleas back. And, Greg, where does this leave Fani Willis?
Yeah, well, she just won re-election, so she does have another 4 years in office. There was a Republican challenger who tried to make this case a big part of her argument that Fani Willis should be unseated. Fulton County is one of the biggest Democratic strongholds in Georgia, so there was no surprise that Fani Willis won re-election. But her reputation is damaged, right? This was an unforced error, as we said earlier, and this was all of her own doing, and now it unravels, or it might unravel. One of the signature cases, not just of her career, but in Georgia. So it leaves her damaged, and it'll be interesting to see what case she tries to make when she is expected to appeal this to the Georgia Supreme Court.
It was a great conversation. That's what Elon Musk tweeted last night, appearing to corroborate the reporting that he met with both Donald Trump and Amazon founder Jeff Bezos at Mar-a-Lago last evening. Bezos is the latest in a string of CEOs who have visited President-elect Trump in recent weeks, including Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos, Apple CEO Tim Cook, and the CEO of Google's parent company, Alphabet, Sundar Pichai. Now, Trump's delight that big business is kneeling before him is not exactly a secret.
In the first term, everybody was fighting me. In this term, everybody wants to be my friend. I don't know. My personality changed or something.
Trump is clearly enjoying all of this attention. But what do the CEOs want in return? Joining me now is Brian Schwartz. He is a White House economic policy reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Brian, you've been on this beat doing some great reporting.
Thank you.
Not in the corner at Mar-a-Lago, but clearly well-sourced about who's coming in and coming out. Can you just first talk about how different this courtship is compared to the last time Trump was the incoming president?
Well, it's certainly different from that, but it's also different than what we've seen with President Joe Biden. I mean, this is just kind of worlds different because the CEOs learned last time around Trump 1.0 that going directly to Donald Trump is really the best way to get what you want. With Tim Cook in the first term of Donald Trump, he was regularly in touch with him. And that was a lesson many CEOs took from Tim Cook that how to engage with Trump on a variety of fronts. And it's a regulation or tariffs if they're trying to look for being excluded for some of those impacts from the tariffs. This is what they've learned. And clearly they're going route one now right to Trump at Mar-a-Lago.
You mentioned tariffs, and I feel like I kind of want to break down what interest some of these CEOs may have. This is speculation because we don't actually know what the conversations were, but tariffs seem to be like the looming cloud on the horizon for a lot of these big business CEOs. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the sort of relationship with Trump and maybe these CEOs as it concerns those tariffs?
Well, my sense on it is that this is one of the reasons why many of these executives are getting close to Trump now, because Trump has been very, very clear about what he's going to do or what he intends to do when he becomes president with these tariffs. He's going to try to put it to these tariffs on goods coming from China, potentially from Canada and Mexico. And many of these businesses have business
Apple,
there.
China, big business.
So you're looking at it from a perspective of, okay, wait a minute here. If I can just get close enough to this guy, maybe there's an exemption down the road on some level on tariffs, potentially, right? And that's from what the reporting we've done. That's been the thinking from some of these corporate leaders. We have the story on the Wall Street Journal's website. We had a guy that reached out directly to us to try to get in touch with Peter Navarro because he's trying to figure out how to navigate this situation with Trump as he's about to become president as it comes to tariffs.
It is truly personal relationships that may dictate economic policy on a major scale. I mean, I see it's already clear kind of why big tech would want to make friends or get friendly with Trump. That's Mark Zuckerberg. He's giving $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund, which is effectively just I don't know, what's the right word? It's like a thank you basket that Donald Trump is collecting around January 20th. Google's parent company, Alphabet, their CEO, Sundar Pichai, is down there. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between tech and the incoming Trump administration? Because they have had their knives out for Silicon Valley for a while.
Yeah, I mean, look, after the 2020 election, Donald Trump was very public about the issues he's had with big tech. He pushed these ideas that many of those companies just alluded to were somehow at fault for him losing the 2020 election. So this is really interesting because now these guys are coming right back into the fold again. Mark Zuckerberg, again, who's been under attack by Trump for years, came right into Mar-a-Lago, and now Meta's given the money to the inaugural. And again, it's this beginning clearly of this engagement, one would argue lobbying effort to get close to Trump in case things start to go away that these CEOs may not like when he becomes president.
There's also we talked about in the reader before this segment began. You know, Amazon is seeing what the Teamsters Union is calling the largest strike ever against Amazon unfolding at the peak of the holiday season. There's a lawsuit involving both Musk and Bezos's company and the National Labor Relations Board, something that Trump is going to oversee. I mean, they got a lot of, labor interests that Trump could be a deciding factor in, and having a close relationship with the president could be a boon for business or the opposite.
But also getting to know Elon Musk is going to be critical here. I think, look, what we're seeing in Washington right now, I know I've watched your show, I saw the segments before. Let's get really down to this here. Okay, Elon Musk is clearly going to be one of the most influential CEOs, maybe in the world, because of his proximity to Trump. Maybe there isn't a meeting I have heard of that doesn't include Elon Musk and Donald Trump in the same room, whether it's with business leaders, foreign leaders, with potential hires. This has been going on from our reporting for over a month. I mean, since the end of the election. And, that is something we have to really keep an eye on here as we go forward.
Well, and it's also a potential major conflict of interest. You're saying Elon Musk is, in fact, maybe a shadow president or a deeply, deeply influential advisor. Elon Musk has government contracts that are very, very lucrative through SpaceX. Tesla is subject to, federal regulations. Then, of course, there are his social media properties. I mean, and he could make policy effectively.
Well, also, with the way they teased out this government commission, right? This external group, DOGE, right?
Just say it.
This external advisory group. The way they announced it was that this group is going to have some sort of sway over OMB. Now,
the Office of Management Budget.
Now, anyone who doesn't know what this office is, it's a very powerful office that has sway over regulations and how they're deployed through the various agencies. I mean, that, and we've done reporting on this, that right there is a real potential conflict that Elon's going to have to face in the coming weeks and months ahead.
We'll see if anyone in the administration cares about it. Brian Schwartz with the Wall Street Journal, it's great to have you on the program. Please keep on telling us what is happening down at Mar-a-Lago. We need to know.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Right now in Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin holding his annual hours-long news conference. Here's what NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons asked the Russian leader a short time ago.
Mr. President, Keir Simmons from NBC News. Two questions in English, if you don't mind. Sorry, Mr. Peskov. The first one is about President-elect Trump. Mr. President, you have failed to reach the objectives of your special military operation. Large numbers of Russians have died, including a general assassinated here in Moscow this week. And the leader of Syria, who you supported, has been overthrown. Mr. President, when you face President-elect Trump, you will be the weaker leader. How do you propose to compromise? What are you going to offer?
You asked what we can offer, or I can offer to the President-elect Trump when we meet. I do not know when we are going to meet, because he does not speak about that. I haven't spoken to him for more than 4 years now. You said that this conversation will take place where I'll be in a weakened state. Dear colleague, well, I'm saying dear and distinguished colleague, because though despite all persecutions of our media, Russian media, you are allowed to work here freely. Isn't that good already? To you and to the people who pay your salary in the United States, we'd really like for Russia to be in a weakened state. I'm of a different opinion. I think that Russia became much stronger over the past 2 or 3 years. Why? Because we are becoming a truly sovereign country.
Keir Simmons asking the questions in the room of President Putin, who continues to speak as we sit here now. NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent, host of Andrea Mitchell Reports. The great Andrea Mitchell joins the table. Andrea, so good to see you.
You too.
You've had your fair share of questioning of dictators and authoritarians around the world over the years. What did you see in that exchange? What did you hear from Putin?
Well, first of all, I was so impressed with Keir Simmons. I mean, how cool is he standing up there before the world and in that, with that leader standing right there. But the point is that he is in denial. First of all, the Ukraine war has not gone well for him. He's not going to win the Ukraine war, but he does have a lot of leverage in negotiations. And now he has Donald Trump coming in, who wants an end to the war and says he could end it in 24 hours. So he has that advantage. At the same time, President Biden and his administration, as Secretary of State Blinken will tell you, I'm sure, is surging weapons, munitions, money into Ukraine in these last days before the transition, and trying to set the stage to at least give Zelensky better leverage at the bargaining table. There's going to be a negotiation, that's clear. I was talking to the, outgoing Democratic chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, Ben Cardin, yesterday. We're going to play that on our program later today. And he said this war will end and Putin will not win, but there has to be a negotiation. And the Democrats, the strong supporters of Ukraine, as well as the Republicans, accept that reality, and so does Zelensky.
John, it's interesting to hear on that idea that Trump has put forward that he could solve this in 24 hours in that Time Person of the Year interview, him conceding, well, it's a little more difficult than that, perhaps. But clearly, Vladimir Putin has been playing this waiting game, hoping, expecting that Donald Trump would come to power and give him favorable odds, at least, at the negotiating table.
Yeah, as soon as the invasion to Ukraine didn't go as planned. This was supposed to be a couple of days. They were supposed to take Kyiv. He's been mining the clock, and he's trying to wear down European resistance. At this point, they've held together admirably, Andrea, and now waiting for the U.S. presidential election, and now gets a gift of Donald Trump returning to office. We know how much Trump favored him in his first 4 years. I'll be curious as to what you think. If the U.S. does indeed start to withdraw, the pressure on Zelensky to get to that table, will Europe also say, you know what, it's time for this to end? It's time to start talking negotiations? Up until now, no, but look at what's happening in Europe. Collapse in Germany of the coalition, in France. We're talking about Canada now, Trudeau as well, another key NATO member. Erdogan feeling his oaths because he has so much leverage in Syria. The counterpoint there is that Russia has lost all of its influence and is withdrawing from its bases in Syria and has, collapsed as Iran did there. So there's this trade-off. Russia has, that was a big defeat for Russia. At the same time, Europe is not as big a counterweight. NATO is going to be weaker. Donald Trump is coming in at the best possible time for him to have maximum leverage.
What's the role of China still in Ukraine?
China is supporting Russia and doing it just up against that red line, not giving them weapons per se, but giving them the components for weapons. So it is still, it's certainly helping them. But the big factor now is North Korea. The North Korean troops, they don't seem to be doing that well on the battlefield, right, but they are cannon fodder. Yeah. So that's an endless supply of troops. And they are also giving very important, they're getting technology for their missiles so that they're better targeted from Russia, but they're giving missiles to Russia, and they've been getting, support from Iran, the drones. But at this point, Iran is also on its back feet. So there's a lot in play right now, an incredibly important time.